Wisconsin Eye begins its coverage of the April 3 election for a 10-year term on the Wisconsin Supreme Court today by interviewing one of three candidates, Tim Burns of Middleton. Tim, thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Steve. So happy to be here.
Well, thank you. Give us a quick summary of your background and why you're running, sir.
Sure. In terms of summary of my background, I'm very different from most judicial candidates. I'm not the child of a lawyer or grandchild of a lawyer like my opponents. My grandparents were Mississippi sharecroppers, and my father was forced out of school by poverty in the 5th grade, my mother in the 10th grade. And the only reason I'm here today is because of our great middle-class democracy of my childhood. We had great public schools, great public libraries. I was able to work hard and become one of the top lawyers in the country. In terms of why I'm running, 3 reasons, really. The first is equal opportunity for the children of people who struggle has disappeared in the short span of my adulthood in this country. And courts and our Wisconsin Supreme Court is part of the problem. They've been looking out for special interests and big business, but we're focusing on small farms, small businesses, and workers and working families. Second reason, this is the Supreme Court that upheld a photo ID law that made it so Hillary Clinton didn't receive Wisconsin's electoral votes. Every major political decision in this country sooner or later finds its way to the courts. That's not me, that's Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s. And in order to get back to our progressive traditions in this country, the best of us, we need to change these courts. And finally, I'm running because Trump is packing the federal courts with right-wing ideologues who are not going to protect our basic rights like the right to vote, workers' rights, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, and reproductive rights. Increasingly, we're going to have to look to our state courts to protect those rights.
Now, have you held any state or local office before? Have you run before?
No.
First-time candidate?
First-time candidate.
So what have you learned as a candidate for the state's highest court?
Well, the money in politics situation is even worse than I thought it was as an outsider looking in. Money dominates our politics, and concentrated wealth dominates our politics, and even folks in the center left try to shape the message of folks like me, strong progressive Democrats, and their ability to do so comes down to a lot of money in our politics. And so I'm very troubled by the issue. I was troubled with Citizens United, but to see it in person I know we're on a knife's edge as a democracy. And there's so much we can be proud of, and we can be such a great democracy, but it's going to take a lot of work to get that back. It's a struggle for every generation between our democracy and concentrated wealth, and we have to really be pushing back over these next 3 or 4 years to take our country back.
Should Citizens United be repealed, sir?
Yes, absolutely. I disagree entirely with the decision, and now that I'm running for office, I disagree with it even more. It's an abomination. It's not required by the First Amendment in any way, shape, or form.
So campaign cash is corroding both our partisan and our nonpartisan, because you're seeking a nonpartisan office. But you have found, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you have found the emphasis on campaign cash corrosive even on our state Supreme Court?
Oh, and absolutely.
Because of the amount of dollars are involved, or who's giving them?
Both. And let me just make a point about nonpartisan elections. remember that...
Are they still nonpartisan?
Not in any meaningful
Because
sense.
I know you and Justice Dallett spoke to the state Democratic Convention.
They're not nonpartisan in a meaningful sense. They're nonpartisan only in the fact that I can't put a D by my name when I'm on the ballot. But let me say a word about nonpartisan elections. Remember that nonpartisan elections were created out of an earlier generation struggle with concentrated wealth. The folks in the late 1800s, early 1900s believed that big money dominated our political parties, and they created the nonpartisan election process to take the courts out of the domination of the political parties. That's not our problem today. Okay. The right wing concentrated wealth learned how to deal with that problem. They threw a lot of money directly into the process. Our problem today isn't political parties. Our problem today is the citizens united in that money flowing directly into elections. And the only chance we have to fight concentrated wealth is through a combination of our political party that cares about the issue, the Democratic Party, and progressive grassroots. It's only when those two come together that we have a chance to beat back the oligarchy that's starting to control our country.
Citizens United, of course, was a U.S. Supreme Court ruling. If you were elected to Wisconsin's court, how could you work to reform a campaign system that you've just labeled as corrupt, as one of 7 justices?
Well, look, in the short term, it's going to be through fierce dissents, because I'm under no illusion that I'm stepping onto a court where 4 judges will still be arrayed against my view of the world. But what you do is you make sure that you state those views strongly and clearly in those dissents, but you work to change that court, and we can have a progressive majority on that court. By the spring of 2020, we can elect one. They'll start to serve a bit later in the year, and I think that's what needs to happen.
On the issue of campaign finance, how are you leading by example? What limits are you putting on who can give to your campaign, Tim?
Well, look, I'd love to say that I have the luxury of a lot of huge campaign donors who I can turn away, but the truth is, it's a struggle to raise money in the state right now. We have, numerous gubernatorial
16 or 17 Democratic candidates.
And
Senator Baldwin's asking for money, and there's a few.
It's a challenge. It hasn't been an issue for my campaign at the moment that, we've received, I think our very largest campaign donation is something like $7,500, if I'm remembering correctly. I will tell you that I agree with the rules petition proposed by the reserve judges, that if someone gives an inordinate amount of money, their rule was $10,000, and that seems to be common sense to my campaign. I wouldn't be inclined to sit on their case, because you have to have the perception in our justice system that justice isn't bought and paid for.
Would you, you just said if an individual, if a group or a special interest organization that played a role in your campaign, either trying to elect you or defeat you, contributed $10,000, then you would get off that case. Would you publicly state, well, I'm sorry, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Do you want to clarify that?
Let me say that 2 things. I think if we're going to have any ability to take back the state in line with our best traditions as a people, that progressive Democrats like me can't afford to play by a different rule book than the other side's playing for. But certainly when I'm on that court, if we have a progressive majority, we would be holding hearings, and I would be personally in favor of that rules petition. I don't want people to see justice as being bought in the state.
Current rules allow justices to just say they're getting off a case. Do you think they should publicly state the reason why? Because all they have to do now is file a "I am stepping aside."
You know, that it sounds like a reasonable, common sense approach to say why you're getting off of a case. In some situations, there might be considerations of privacy, so I would like to look at that issue more in terms of particular situation where there might be privacy issues involved.
A majority of the court just closed the open administrative conferences. Do you think they should be reopened to the public,
Absolutely.
sir? Okay. You and I have heard a lot of candidates running for the judiciary branch say they can't take positions. You're the exact opposite. You just spoke about your opposition to photo ID. Your website says, do you want a Supreme Court to protect your right to hike and fish in Wisconsin free from pollution? What's the greatest threat to Wisconsin's environment, Tim?
There are numerous threats to the environment, but it really comes down to the same issue, because if our democracy thrives, we will have an environment that's protected. Right now, it is in our democracy that's being protected. It's these special interests, whether it's fracking or not having to follow common sense environmental rules. If you're, you know, a huge conglomerate that the state wants to attract, like Foxconn, and so the threat to our democracy ends up being the same threat to our environment. We have to get power back to the people and away from concentrated corporate wealth.
Well, can I interpret by what you just said that you're very concerned or against some of the fracking that's going on in Wisconsin, number one, and number two, against the Foxconn incentive package?
Yeah, let me say, I'm not prejudging a case that comes before me. What I'm telling you is my political value. And so let's take Foxconn first.
Could you sit on a Foxconn challenge?
Certainly.
Even though you don't think it's the best interest of the state?
It is a political matter. I am opposed to the notions of large corporations playing on a different playing field from our small farms and our small businesses. And subsidies end up tilting the playing field, especially giant subsidies and relaxation of regulation. But let me be real clear. I don't have a concrete case about Foxconn before me. I don't have anybody arguing what particular law applies to the situation, whether it runs afoul of a constitutional provision. What I'm telling you as a political value matter is I'm deeply concerned. You know, I started this campaign with an op-ed. Actually, a week before I started the campaign, I had an op-ed about how the Senate shouldn't confirm Neil Gorsuch to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I started that op-ed intentionally with the scene from Woodrow Wilson's presidential run in 1912, and he was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and stepped off of the train to whistle stop speech. And he looked at the crowd and he said, "Do you want to be a country or state or a community where you sit around waiting for the next corporate conglomerate to move to your neighborhood? Or do you want to be a country where your sons and daughters have the ability to open their own small business or own their own small farm and compete on a level playing field with those corporate conglomerates?" I throw my lot in with the second choice. I want our small business, small farms to compete on a level playing field. That's a political value matter. Concrete.
But on rules of law, on issues of law, let's try to get specific. If the Foxconn incentives is challenged in court, and the State Department of Justice files a motion to recuse you because of what you just said, and attorneys for Foxconn file a motion to recuse because of what you just said, how are you going to respond, sir?
I will look at the motion and decide whether the motion is consistent with the law and what I'm required to do. Until I hear their arguments, I'm not going to pre-decide even that motion.
Do you support what's been the concept of a civil Gideon, the fact that low income should have a right to an attorney in child support, eviction cases, et cetera?
Yeah.
Who should pay for it?
Absolutely. Well, who should pay for it? We are the richest country in the history of the planet. And one of our strongest moral values is the right to a fair trial. It is absolutely insane that we don't protect that right because it's not being paid for. It should be paid for with higher taxes, and particularly higher taxes on the wealthiest of our citizens.
I'm quoting here from your campaign website. Do you want a Supreme Court that protects your right to ask for pay raise, regardless if you ask by yourself or collectively with your fellow workers? Is this a reference to Act 10 and collective bargaining?
Sure, and I've been actually very clear on my view of the Supreme Court case upholding Act 10. Then I think it was wrongly decided. It troubles me greatly because, remember, I've spent my lifetime reading about our law and our history as a people. I am convinced that you don't get that great shining city on a hill that we aspire to be unless you have a strong middle class economy, and we don't anymore. And the components of a middle class economy, small farms, small business, thriving worker movements, thriving diverse communities, thriving public education. Act 10 attacked thriving workers movement. It attacked public education, and for most of us, it was a pretty transparent act to try to defund one of our political parties. It is blatantly unconstitutional.
How important is it that the court be collegial? Because you've just said you're willing to dissent on some of these major issues. As long as the court resolves cases, you're fine with that, and collegiality is not one of your priorities?
Look, let me say that I wouldn't phrase it is collegiality be one of my priorities, but treating all people, whether I agree with them or not, with respect and dignity is one of my priorities. And that's how I would behave on the court. Do I think for a moment that that's going to lead to converts to my point of view? Do I think it's enough to just be collegial? In your words, no. Our democracy is on a knife's edge, and I plan to go on that court and try to make it so we have a progressive majority.
Early in the interview, you mentioned President Trump. What do you think is his legacy after being in office 1 year, sir?
Well, after being in office 1 year, he is, in all likelihood, will go down as our worst president, our greatest failure as a president, our biggest danger to our civil rights, our biggest concern that parts of our democracy don't function too well, that someone like him could be elected, but also a warning that Our democracy isn't immune from the problems that other democracies have faced. If your middle class dies, if it withers, if your small farms and small businesses and diverse communities and worker movements, public education die, you end up with the Trumps of this world. We can't afford to let that happen.
Should he be impeached?
Let me say this. I am deeply concerned about first the possibility and the likelihood that the Russians interfered in our election and he had something to do with it. I'm deeply concerned with what he did with firing Jim Comey. I think it has raised huge issues, and in a different era, it isn't could he be impeached, it's he would be impeached if he had if he had behaved the way that he is behaving right now in the 1970s or the 1960s, there would have been impeachment and a trial of impeachment by the Senate, and I couldn't imagine him surviving that trial of impeachment.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Two final questions. The Chief Justice, in her budget recommendations for the current budget cycle, recommended pay raises for judges, some of them up to 16%. Do judges need a pay raise, Mr. Burns?
Let me say this, that I think that we do want to attract good public officials, and we want to make sure that we're not engineering our pay of public officials in a way that only the rich, only the powerful, only the people with inherited wealth can run for office. So my concern for pay for public officials, and I haven't looked specifically at the Supreme Court pay, but my concern for pay for public officials, whether it's a school teacher or the Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, it is, are we attracting the right people to our most important functions, and are we creating a democracy where only the rich can afford to serve?
Then my final question, what are your differences between you and your primary opponents, Judge Skronik in Sauk County and Judge Dallett in Milwaukee County?
So really there, I would say, and we've covered some of them, so I'll be brief. There are differences in background, experience, and candor. Background we talked about. I'm the only non-lawyer's kid running, and I think that makes a difference. Experience, I'm the only candidate with national reputation as a lawyer, and it's a very good reputation. I'm the only candidate who's spent a quarter of a century standing up to our biggest businesses, and we need that on the court right now. I'm the only candidate with appellate court experience. I was one of the handful of law students chosen to serve on the United States Court of Appeals. Finally, candor. I worry that my opponents seem to be saying things that are radically different for how they've behaved in public or public life. That we have one candidate saying he can be fair and impartial on abortion cases, but 30 years ago he was out protesting and arrested at abortion clinics. We have another candidate, Judge Dallett, who says the court is broken and she has the experience and values to fix it, but this is the same judge, Judge Dallett, who 5 years ago supported conservative Chief Justice Pat Roggensack when she was running for re-election against a progressive, Ed Fallone, who would have been our first Latino justice on our Supreme Court. Okay. I am what I am.
Thank you. Tim Burns of Middleton is one of 3 candidates for the 10-year term on the Supreme Court that will be decided first. The primary on February 20. Want to get the date right. The two winners of the primary will go on to the general election on April 3. Mr. Burns, a pleasure meeting you.
Good to meet you.
Thanks for your
Steve.
time.
Thank you.